Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Werner, Penn LDI's Executive Director, and I want to welcome you to today's panel about the election, how the midterms could impact health policy. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's moderator for the panel. Dave Grandy is an Associate Professor of Medicine here at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the Director of Policy at LDI. And so Dave will be leading today's discussion. Thanks, Dave.
All right, thanks, Rachel. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. And of course, as all of you know, we don't know the full results from the election yet, but we certainly have a lot to talk about. In the run-up to the midterms, many pundits and news outlets predicted the Democrats would lose badly, which would be in line with history. The party in power tends to lose congressional seats in the years between presidential elections. This year did turn out to be different, but the election season was defined by several strong forces: high inflation and low approval ratings for Joe Biden, a Republican focus on crime, major legislative wins for Joe Biden, though, including the Inflation Reduction Act, which contained major landmark healthcare provisions focused on prescription drugs, and of course, the landmark decision by the Supreme Court to end Americans' constitutional right to abortion. The House at this point appears likely to go from a slim Democratic majority to a slim Republican majority, though we don't know for sure yet. And the Senate is really unknown at this stage and could go either way. If Republicans win Arizona or Nevada, we'll have to wait again until December for the Georgia runoff. And if the Democrats can win both, then we will know sooner rather than later. But the real question for us today is, what does all of this mean for health policy? And over the next hour, I will ask our three experts to unpack the results of the election, or at least what we know as of now, and discuss what it might mean for healthcare policy in the United States going forward. So let me introduce our three panelists. The first is Molly Ann Brody. Molly is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer and Executive Director of Public Opinion and Survey Research at the Kaiser Family Foundation. In addition to her research to understand U.S. views on healthcare policy, Dr. Brody runs Kaiser's polling operation. And there's really no better organization or person to share what Americans think about health policy. So thank you, Molly, for joining us. Then we have Dan Hopkins, an LDI Senior Fellow and Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. And his research explores questions related to American political behavior and policymaking. And he's the author of The Increasingly United States: How and Why American Political Behavior Nationalized. And then lastly, we have Allison Hoffman, an LDI Senior Fellow and Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. And her work examines health insurance regulation, the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, and long-term care. So thank you again to the three of you for joining this exciting conversation today. I'm going to start by asking Molly to get us started by sharing some of the latest insights from polling around Election Day on American views on health policy and how those views may have impact voting. So we don't often show slides during our virtual seminars, but we make a special exception this week because we have hot off the press information from the latest public opinion polling. So I'm going to let Molly take it from here, and I know she's going to pull some slides up on the screen.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. And I am showing some slides that are hot off the press. We just actually released a report today about the role of abortion in the election. So you can find that on our website. But basically, here are the main midterm election takeaways that the pundits and election analysts have said. I imagine most of you have heard these sorts of things from your favorite news source. But basically, clearly we still live in a 50-50 nation. We're deeply divided. I personally think fractured is a better way to think about it, especially when we're thinking about health policy. There's within party and between party divisions. And so, we'll get to this, but clearly stalemate is one major option for us going forward. As Dave said, it did not turn out to be a Republican wave election. Local and state issues and politics mattered a lot. Individual candidates mattered a lot, including the extent to which they were supported by President Trump. Democrats outperformed the election fundamentals. The turnout was closer to the 2018 surge, more so than a kind of a normal midterm for a party in power. The base definitely turned out. And as Dave said, the economy and inflation dominated the issue list, but certainly the Dobbs decision on abortion mattered, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, All of this is certainly consistent with my views and observations as well. But what I really want to focus on is the role that the issues played, particularly healthcare issues, not all those other factors that we know influence the outcome. I think you all know that in the last decade or so, healthcare has been a major topic discussed in elections. And in some cases, like the 2018 midterms, healthcare, especially the concern about repealing the ACA and the pre-existing condition provisions, was shown to be really impactful in terms of actual outcomes in individual races. So the question is, what about this year? Do we see anything like that? Well, based on the 2022 midterm voter survey conducted by AP Votecast, as predicted, inflation and economy was the issue that was on the largest share of voters' minds. You see there, 51% said it was the single most important factor to their vote. But look how high democracy was as well. 44% said it was an important factor to their vote. 1/4 of voters did say the Supreme Court case was the single most important factor. And on a separate list in the exit polls, about the most important problem facing the country, again, you see that economy and jobs ranked right at the top across all of voters. But for Democratic voters, abortion was second, and you can see healthcare sort of scattered along here as well. So there was a variety of issues on people's mind, albeit that, the economy was at the top. So the economy was at the top, but abortion was in the mix, as I just said. But to get a better measure of whether the abortion in the Supreme Court case actually motivated turnout or changed any minds about who to vote for, we added some supplemental questions in conjunction with AP on the Votecast survey. And you can see here that overall about 4 in 10 voters said that the Supreme Court decision did have a major impact on their decision about turning out to vote, about whether to turn out to vote. And almost half said it had a major impact on which candidate they supported. Now, this was true for higher shares of Democrats, of young voters, of women of reproductive age, and of first-time voters. So it does suggest that the abortion issue did motivate new voters and the enthusiastic turnout for Democrats. We saw the same patterns in all the states with abortion on the ballot. As I think most of you know, California, Michigan, and Vermont voted to enshrine abortion protections, while voters in Kentucky voted down a state constitutional ban on abortion. In all of these states, Democrats and women of reproductive health age said they were more motivated by Roe to come out and vote, and they were considerably more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. Now, this may have been particularly influential in Michigan, where Governor Whitmer won by a wider margin than expected, and both legislative bodies are now in Democratic control. And I'll also note that we saw this exact same pattern in states with the most competitive Senate races, including your very own Pennsylvania. But I should also note that we saw these same patterns in Georgia, where the Democratic candidate for governor lost, and the Senate race is off to a rematch. So clearly abortion wasn't the only factor that mattered in the outcomes. Now, another way that abortion mattered, albeit at the margin, was in terms of crossover votes. So nationally, about 13% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents told us that the Supreme Court decision was the most important factor in their vote, but relatively few of those, just 9%, ended up actually casting ballots for the Democratic candidate. But in certain states with the competitive races, like Pennsylvania and Arizona, 1 in 5 of those Roe-focused Republican voters did end up voting for the Democratic Senate candidate. So this is a small share of total voters, but these kinds of crossover votes may matter in these super close elections. And then my last piece of evidence that the Roe decision brought out the Democratic base and really quite fundamentally flipped the election politics of abortion on its head comes from both the network exit poll and the AP Votecast midterm voter survey. It showed that those who were really angry about Roe, they were the ones who disproportionately voted Democrat. So that's basically the bottom bar on each of these sets of data. The second to bottom bar on each set is the dissatisfied but not angry group. And you see that in both of those cases, they split the congressional vote. And then the voters at the top are the ones who are either happy or satisfied about the decision. And those voters tended to vote for the Republican. So I do think one big takeaway when we're thinking about going forward is that the politics of abortion in election is flipped on its head from the past 50 years. In the past, Republicans used this issue to rally their base. This time around, it was definitely the Democrats. So clearly, abortion helped, I think, deliver the Democrats their greater than expected showing. But what about the other healthcare issues that we all talk about or work on every day? Now, historically, whenever an election is about the economy, when we dig deeper, we find that healthcare costs are usually a major part of people's economic concerns. So another supplemental question that we added to the AP VoteCast survey had to deal with what did voters mean by inflation and rising prices? Which prices and costs were really on their minds as they cast their votes? Note here that groceries and food costs top that list. This was across all demographic groups and points to how hard inflation is really hitting people in their day-to-day life. But also note that healthcare and prescription drug costs were in the mix as well. But I think what's most important as we sit here and talk about what's going to happen next, I think just note here that those who are most worried about healthcare prices, they were more than twice as likely to vote for the Democratic candidate than the Republican candidate. So I think it reminds us that healthcare is still an issue that really works in Democrats' favor. So even in a divided government, I think we could see the case that Democrats have the motivation to keep working on healthcare topics. Now, I'll also just note there were a lot of ballot initiatives around the country that addressed healthcare more directly, like the South Dakota Medicaid expansion, the Arizona ballot measure around reducing the burden of medical debt. Massachusetts approved a medical loss ratio for dental insurance. I think maybe we can talk about that more in the conversation, but I'm going to stop there as I stop sharing my screen and see what other questions, and looking forward to the discussion. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Molly. That is a lot of great hot off the press information that I think will be part of our conversation going forward. Before I come back to you, though, I do want to ask some of our other panelists to jump in on some of their reflections. So, Dan, let me go to you. Having heard what Molly just shared and your own observations of the election, what do you think the key lessons are of the election outcome, at least as we know them today? And given that, the outcome was a bit unexpected, what do you think are some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, and I just want to say thanks to you, David. Thanks to Rachel. Thanks to the opportunity to share the panel. I, on Monday, confidently told my students that they should expect a significant pro-Republican movement on Tuesday. And as the results became clear, because as David mentioned, one of the clearest regularities that we have going back to 1934 is that the party in power does poorly in midterm elections. The party that holds the presidency almost always loses seats, and in recent years has lost at least a chamber of Congress. Now, it is likely, certainly not certain yet, but likely that the Democrats will lose the House of Representatives. And that's going to have very important implications for what the legislation that we see in the next couple of years. And I also think it's noteworthy that the Democrats, though they seem likely to have held on to the Senate, are facing a 2024 Senate cycle in which they're going to have to defend a variety of Senate seats in places like West Virginia, Montana, here in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin. And so if I had to bet right now, I would not expect the Democrats to hold the Senate in 2024. Of course, it's a long way off. But what that says is then that if the Democrats do succeed in holding the Senate by winning 2 of Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, they will then have a 2-year window to continue to confirm judicial nominees. I know something that Allison's going to talk more about. And they'll also have a 2-year window in which they will control at least one branch of Congress. However, as we can remember from the Congress that followed the 2010 election, Republicans holding the House may well lead to a period of real brinksmanship. Health policy may be involved. It was in 2013 that we saw a shutdown over the Affordable Care Act. Current law, and David mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, has extended additional subsidies through the ACA for another few years, but that will invariably be a contentious issue, and especially important if, as I expect will happen, the Republicans may well take back the Senate in after 2024. I would also just briefly point out that the Medicaid expansion continues to be very, very popular when it is put directly to voters. So South Dakota voted to expand Medicaid, leaving, I believe now, just 11 states, largely in the US South, that have not chosen to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. And I'd also say that though the results are still coming in, we saw that the electorate was had slightly more Republicans than Democrats, but that was offset by some of the factors that Molly talked about with respect to slightly more Republicans casting ballots for Democratic candidates than the reverse. Partly that is related to the quality of some of the candidates on the top of the ticket. But it's worth noting too that because Senate seats are held for 3 times as long as House seats, and because there are only 100 Senate seats versus 435 House seats, we can roughly say that a Senate seat is worth 13 House seats. And so the fact that the Democrats seem potentially to have narrowly hung on in several Senate seats is going to yield long-term impacts in terms of their ability at least to confirm judicial nominees and to have leverage within Congress. But I nonetheless expect that if the Republicans have a 1, 3, 5, 7 seat majority in the House of Representatives, we could be in for tremendous brinksmanship and a lot of reporting about internal debates in the Republican caucus as some of the right-wing members, such as the Freedom Caucus, try to use their leverage in the House caucus to advance their agenda. And at the same time, you will have some newly elected, New York is sending a surprising number of Republicans to Congress, like suburban New York alone, suburban New York City. And so how those members are willing to play the brinksmanship that I expect will go a long way towards telling us what the next 2 years look like federally. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. So before I jump to Allison, actually, just a quick follow-up there. So I guess what you're suggesting is a lot of the things that we might think could be part of negotiations in divided government have the potential to be strongly influenced by just how razor thin that majority is, assuming that the Republicans have a majority in the House. And so it sounds like from what you're saying that a very small number of potential members of Congress from more moderate districts could have a pretty enormous influence on the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Hastert rule, which got its name from former Republican Speaker Dennis Hastert, is that the House Republicans would proceed with anything that had majority support of the majority, right? And so building, as we saw with all of the machinations around John Boehner's Republican speakership, and then Boehner was ousted, it could be a very, very challenging period of time for whether it's Kevin McCarthy or whomever is the Republican speaker, if the Republicans do hang on by a narrow margin. And I think you could both see the politics on the centrist side, right? These new suburban Republicans from New York and potentially from California, depending on how those races turn out, being very influential. But at the same time, given the stark partisan divides and given all of the powers that come with controlling the chamber, appointing the committee chairs, we could also be in for a real period of brinksmanship, deadlock, and a lot of reporting about the Republican caucus being unable to even agree as to what deals it would accept to continue government funding. And I think one of the questions in the lame duck session that is before us is how much kind of legislative brushwork will be cleared away. But I think, I anticipate Allison will have a lot more to say about that.
Great, thanks, Dan. And as we transition to Allison, I do just want to remind our audience, if you have some questions that you want to pose to our panelists, I'll try to get to some of them over the course of the next 40 minutes. So feel free to post those to the Q&A. But let's turn to Allison. Dan mentioned the courts. So obviously the courts are a major function of the US Senate in terms of confirming judges. And so, where are we at in that process in terms of the Biden administration, and depending on sort of the ultimate outcome of what we see in those 3 states remaining, how might this be impactful in some way? So I know you have a couple of slides you want to share as well. So if you want to bring those up on the screen, feel free to do that.
Sure, yeah, let me do that. Hang on one moment. Okay, you see those?
Yep.
Okay, great. So as I watched, I think this has just been a fascinating election so far. Obviously, there's still a lot more to learn. And as I was watching a number of things, I was watching the state elections. I think we had a number of interesting gubernatorial elections that we may talk about at some point. The ballot initiatives have just been fascinating in the healthcare space on abortion and beyond. But one of the pieces I've been watching very closely is what was happening in the Senate. And why the Senate is particularly important is because the Senate is where we get federal judicial nominees confirmed. And so to help illuminate why this is important, let me go backwards for a moment to show you something that I think is not talked about a lot, which is that President Biden has been extremely successful in nominating and having the Senate confirm federal court appointees. So this is a picture of Biden's judicial appointments in the first 566 days of his tenure. And you could see, so the different colors here are the darker color is appeals court judges, and then the lighter color is district court judges. And you could see that, you know, he has had at that point 75 nominees confirmed, and the number has gone up even from there. And so, if you look at since this time to date, there have been 84 federal judges confirmed during his presidency. And so it's not just numbers, it's also the composition of these judges. So if you break down the nominees by race on the left-hand side and by gender on the right-hand side, you could see each of the presidents mapped by the percentage of their nominees who are confirmed based on being a member of a minority or by being identifying as female. And so, you know, Biden has had nearly 3/4 of his nominees be either minority nominees confirmed or women confirmed. And that really has far outpaced any other president. And so he is reshaping the judiciary in a really remarkable way that hasn't been talked about. Now, why that matters for this election? Well, it doesn't matter so much in some ways because at least in the short term for health policy, courts are not going to be the major locus of positive advancements in health policy. We saw this with the Dobbs decision, things that reached the Supreme Court. We're going to have a Supreme Court that's going to be skeptical of large steps in terms of health policies. But it still matters because as you think about populating these lower courts, the district courts and the appeals courts, it shapes the way decisions come up through the courts. And it also shapes the future members of the appeals courts in the Supreme Court. Often as you think about nominees to the appeals courts and at some point in the future nominees to the Supreme Court, often presidents think about pulling those nominees from the lower federal courts. It also matters because when judges decide things in lower courts, it shapes how the appeals courts and then the Supreme Courts think about those matters. So think about these cases that have been coming through Texas with judges like somebody like Reed O'Connor, who says bombastic things like, if the individual mandate is unconstitutional, the entire Affordable Care Act should fall. Then that is the decision that the appeals court is thinking about. And then when these cases get to the Supreme Court, they're dealing with what these judges have said below them. Okay, so how does this election matter? Nominees go to the Judiciary Committee in the Senate side, which is now chaired by Dick Durbin. Chuck Grassley is the minority member. And the Judiciary Committee has hearings, and then it sends these nominees to the floor of the Senate to confirm them. If you have a 50-50 split in the Senate, then the committee composition is split between Democrats and Republicans under a power sharing agreement, which is what we've had so far, with the chair, Dick Durbin, right now having more power to move people through. If you have a 51-49 split, so if Mark Kelly looks good in Arizona right now, Cortez Masto in Nevada is not looking great, but could pull it off still, and then we'll have the runoff in Georgia. If you end up with a 51-49 split, Democrats would have more power over that committee composition, and then the ability to move candidates through and to confirm them. There are 89 current vacancies on federal courts, 10% of the total number of seats. And there are 59, once the administration has officially nominated a number of people and has several nominees pending. Once all of those become pending nominees, there'll be 57 pending nominees. Some of them are awaiting floor votes. Some of them are awaiting hearings in the Judiciary Committee. Actually, there's a hearing scheduled for next week to start moving people through. So to the extent that this doesn't all happen before the Senate switches over in January, it'll be really important what the composition of that committee looks like to Biden's ability to continue to appoint people to these federal courts and have them confirmed. If we see Republicans take the Senate, which looks less likely at this point, but is not impossible, it could mean gridlock in this regard. Historically, there has been bipartisan compromise on judicial nominees and confirmations, but this is a more divided Congress than we have seen in those eras in history where we saw bipartisan compromise on confirmations. And if there is bipartisan compromise, it's going to mean that Biden is going to have to nominate candidates who are more likely to get that bipartisan support. And so it could change the nature of the people who he is putting forward for judicial appointment as well. So let me stop there and.
All right, thank you, Allison. We'll just get the slides off the screen. And as we're doing that, I want to shift to the topic of the Inflation Reduction Act. So, if we were to think about the Inflation Reduction Act, it really represented a landmark policy achievement for the Democrats and the Biden administration. As long as I can remember, there's been conversations around giving Medicare the authority to negotiate prescription drugs. It was thought to be dead and then suddenly revived and became a big legislative win. Yet from my observations, you didn't hear much about the Inflation Reduction Act during the election, despite it being an enormous legislative achievement from a Democratic perspective. So my question to all of you is, is my casual observations of the election correct? Did it not really play much of a role? And then secondly, some conversation about, do we think that divided government and bricksmanship will lead to some threats to some of those policies that were actually part of the IRA? So Molly, maybe you can take this one first.
Yeah, let me start with its role in the election. I mean, you're right. It had health policy proposals that were very popular, and they were at the top of the public's wish list for congressional action. The negotiation, the lowering prescription drug prices, putting caps on insulin. They were popular. It was great news for Democrats on the Hill and certainly for the administration. And they all thought that they were going to get this election bounce. So they hoped for an election bounce out of these popular provisions finally becoming law. But I will say all of our pre-election polling showed us that actually very few people knew that the policies had become law. It just didn't get, there's too many other things going on to break through the media agenda. And we found that only, large majority say they thought these things had either not passed or they just had no idea. So while they were really popular among Democrats and independents, and certainly among those 65 and older who were most impacted by most of those changes were Medicare changes, they made excellent talking points on the campaign trail. And I certainly know they were talked about on the campaign trail, and there was certainly a handful of ads about them. But I think at the end of the day, it just couldn't break through given everything else that was going on. And so at the end of the day, I don't think it mattered very much in terms of the outcomes we saw.
If I could just jump in, David, and add a little bit to that. So those of us who were here in Philadelphia watching, say, the Philadelphia Phillies march through the playoffs, got to watch a lot of political ads. And we know that, at least in this race, the advertising didn't really focus on direct policy questions. And certainly the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS, many of the Democrats' accomplishments, the American Rescue Plan, the Congress that is now drawing to a close spent record amounts of money on citizens in a wide variety of ways, expanded child tax credit, the various Inflation Reduction Act policies that Molly just mentioned, as well as many targeting climate. And yet many of the Senate Democrats at least didn't really talk about those policies on the campaign trail, at least not compared to other issues, say like Dobbs. And this is consistent with a lot of research. I have been really lucky to draw upon the data that Molly has collected over the last decade to see that even when people do start to concretely benefit from policies like the Medicaid expansion, or they participate in the exchanges, many of those people become only marginally more favorable towards the Affordable Care Act. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. We are in such a complex, fragmented healthcare environment that there are so many ways in which even those who purchase insurance, say via the exchanges, the government's role in keeping prices low or subsidizing prices may be obscured. And there are so many issues that people face that I think for a wide range of reasons, spending a lot of government money is not an effective way to directly build a political coalition or to directly build support with voters. But that said, I think, I expect that many people in the audience are health policy advocates. And I would just say that the work that you do then is so important because you are both materially improving healthcare conditions that citizens face, but that citizens, given the wide range of issues that citizens face in our daily lives, and given the fact that very few of us are single issue voters, it's very, very hard to send a clear signal on a specific issue like health policy when we only get to vote every 2 years.
Great, thanks. As we think about this divided government environment that we potentially may be moving toward, we of course still have a lame duck session coming up before a realignment of Congress. And so, have any of you been able to read the tea leaves a bit on what we might expect to happen over this lame duck session coming up?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I'm sure everybody has some thoughts on that. There are two structural things that are important to understand about the lame duck period. One is that the period leading up to the elections is not the moment for any kind of bipartisan compromise. The one party doesn't want to make the other look good. And so that has kind of passed by the time the lame duck period arises, and there's increased incentive for bipartisan compromise. Dan alluded to another reason why there might be even more incentive at this particular moment in time. And actually, Molly talked about this in the beginning of her comments as well, which is that imagine that that we do get a Republican House, and imagine that then McCarthy has to try to get the Republicans in the House to agree on anything. That is going to be a very challenging job. And so McCarthy may want to see, imagining that it is, that McCarthy is in that role, the decks cleared before that moment happens, and to get some things done because of the difficulty of tying together the pieces of the Republican Party in the House. So we're seeing a number of things already talked about. Some of them will be, we'll see some riders on the year-end omnibus spending bill, so things that get attached to that bill. Some of the things that have been talked about are FDA riders, things promoting diversity in clinical trials, thinking about this advanced authorization pathway that the FDA has been using, and enabling them to recall drugs that aren't working well under that advanced pathway. Maybe some revamping of regulation of cosmetics and diagnostic tests, although that would be a bolder move. We may see either, some of this is either in the lame duck period or maybe even beyond. We may see more work on mental health, thinking about extra funding for mental health worker training, more residency slots, trying to get more people to go into the mental health field, and especially in underserved areas. We may see pandemic preparedness funding. There has been talk, if you think also about the dynamics in a committee like the Health Committee, right now, the ranking member, the minority member who's in charge is Senator Burr. And so after the election, Burr is retiring. So after the election, we could imagine somebody like Rand Paul being the ranking member, where compromise is less possible. So you may see them trying to move through some provisions now on pandemic preparedness that may not be possible later. Telehealth is another area we've heard people talking about, making some of the pandemic loosening on telehealth restrictions permanent. And then we see a couple things that may be reactionary to things that have been in the news or the courts recently. So one I'm watching is coverage of dialysis. There was a Supreme Court case last year called Marietta versus DaVita, and it said that plans that limited dialysis coverage don't violate the Medicare as a second payer law, so long as they poorly cover everybody in their plan. As long as they treat people the same, even if it's not covering dialysis care well, that's okay. And so we may see some kind of law trying to create the kind of parity rules that we've seen in the mental health and substance abuse space with regard to dialysis care. And then one piece that I think is a long shot, but I'm still watching, is whether we might see more movement on insulin costs. So that's some of what I see moving out there that could, in this kind of lame duck period, or maybe even beyond, be areas that we could see some bipartisan compromise.
Dan, I don't know if you want to jump in on the lame duck session. It's an interesting dynamic that Republicans may be facing that Allison just pointed out, which is that they may actually have some incentive to want to clear the deck on some issues. I think probably a lot of people don't realize that government funding and the federal budget actually expires in December. And so there is major action needed in order to even continue to fund the government. I don't remember the date, but sometime in December. So might there be sort of less resistance, I guess, to some things happening in the lame duck than you might expect?
That's a good question. And it, of course, depends on your expectations. I think one of the broad challenges is that we appropriate money, or Congress appropriates money, in a different way, a fundamentally different fashion than it used to, right? It used to be that there would be, for a wide range of different issue areas, appropriations bills that made their way through the House and the House and the Senate. And in recent years, with tight partisan control, there's been more reliance on, one party, if it holds both houses, passing a budget and then being able to use reconciliation in the Senate, which is a process that lowers the threshold for legislation from the 60 votes to a majority, so 50 plus 1, and that change has led to a wide range of the sort of dysfunctions of our policymaking process. Right? Why is the Inflation Reduction Act a significant part about healthcare and a significant part about climate? Well, because the only channel through which the Democrats could pass major spending was through the budgetary process. And so I think that I will be watching the lame duck keenly to see how far do they kick the can into the future? Do they kick it? How far into the future do they kick it? Because I'm sure that, different Republicans will have different incentives. Some Republicans will really want to try to create a smooth period and provide McCarthy or whomever the incoming Republican speaker is, if it is indeed a Republican-controlled House, with a longer runway, whereas others may want to inaugurate a much more conflictual period and want to bring conflicts over the debt ceiling or government funding to the fore sooner. So how those debates resolve themselves within a divided Republican Party, I'm not sure, but I'll be watching closely.
Just to add, I also think it matters a little bit what happens in Arizona, Nevada, and how much the Georgia race actually dictates who's controlling the Senate, because there'll be less of an incentive to make a lot of things happen if the Senate can still potentially switch and they could have both houses, the Republicans could have both houses. So I think that, that just adds another sort of level of uncertainty as we go forward.
Just to say, we have never been in a position where a few days after an election, it is conceivable that either party could control either house. So I think that it seems that the Democrats are favored in the Senate and the Republicans in the House. But again, this depends on, the counting of late cast ballots in a handful of Western states.
Yeah, it's a highly uncertain period. I noticed that the New York Times actually gave up on their prediction needle for the election after some certain point in the counting process. They just said, "Oh, well, now it's a bunch of mail-in ballots. That's going to take a while. We're stopping now." So I think a lot of Americans feel the same way right now. What about the Affordable Care Act? It was such a defining issue in elections, going all the way back to honestly, the initial proposals that were made when President Obama ran, and then ultimately those midterms and every election since then. Have we moved past that being a significant political wedge issue? Is it in some sense like settled politically? Like everyone always said, a lot of these issues, they'll be fought about for a decade or so, and then people move on. Have we moved on? And Molly, is that what you're seeing
Yeah, let me talk about that from the public's perspective to start with. So, I think it is very notable that the ACA was not a part of this election's rhetoric at all. Like in the past decade, we had heard so much about repeal and replace as a rallying cry for Republicans to use to get their base out. And that did not happen this election. It really didn't even happen in 2020. And so I do think that because of what had happened when the repeal effort actually went to a vote and didn't pass, I think that ACA repeal is likely a settled case, but that doesn't mean that the ACA is settled, right? There are, there were a lot of ways it was expanded and enhanced under the public health emergency. I think those are all vulnerable. And then in addition, we've witnessed that under a Biden presidency, there are lots of ways that the ACA has been supported and enhanced. Money for navigators, money for advertising around open enrollment periods. And we saw during a Trump presidency that there were many ways to undermine it. So I imagine with the Republicans holding the House, if that's what we assume the outcome is, we might hear a bit more about ways it can be undermined, like withholding money for, for exchanges and for navigators. But at the end of the day, I think that what is clear from the public is that they're still divided on the overall favorability of the ACA, but they are not divided in the fact that they love the things it does. And any threats about taking away things that you're come to count on, like your pre-existing condition, are just, I think legislators have known those are kind of hard-nosed and not worth going after again. But at the margin, lots of things could change. And that's where I think we'll see some action that will affect the ACA one way or another, depending on how everything shakes out.
We definitely haven't heard the last of it in the courts. There is a case moving its way through Texas about the preventive services mandate that is actually one of the more popular pieces of the legislation and is being challenged from many different angles. And that case will move its way on up. And it's an interesting case because it has to do with kind of the broader ability of subgroups and agencies within health and human services and other places in the government to be able to put substantive pieces in place to decide what is, for example, good preventative health care. And so I think that's going to be a really important case that we're going to hear a lot about in the coming months. And then one of the other things I'm watching, which I don't think will be affected by this election, but is interesting, which is that the administration just finalized regulations on a piece called the family glitch, which was a problem in the Affordable Care Act where people who were offered health coverage through their jobs that was unaffordable couldn't get subsidies under the ACA exchanges. And so the administration finally addressed it. And there's talk that if the Republicans gain the House or the House and the Senate, that they may try to go after that new regulation and through funding or some other mechanism. So I think I think the broad stroke attacks are hopefully done, but we're still seeing smaller scale efforts to undermine some of the provisions of the ACA.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That the Republicans had run in 2010, in 2012, in 2014, 2016 on ACA repeal. And that had been in 2010 and in 2014, repealing the ACA was one of the central topics the Republicans advertised on in their campaigns. So when they, to some degree unexpectedly, wound up with control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate after the 2016 election, they felt they needed to move quickly to repeal the ACA. But then what they found is that this is exactly to Molly's point, while at the time, Kaiser Family Foundation polling was indicating that the ACA was viewed unfavorably by more people than it was viewed favorably, when the Republicans moved to concretely repeal it, opinion shifted pretty quickly. It shifted among broad populations, not just those who were tangibly benefiting, but many Americans viewed the ACA more favorably once the alternative was simply repealing rather than replacing it with a credible plan that accomplished many of the things that the ACA did. Kevin McCarthy, in the wake of the 2018 midterms, in which the Republican Party lost the House of Representatives, said that trying to repeal the ACA had cost them the House. And so I think that Molly and Allison are entirely right that at a very high level, the ACA is sufficiently popular that there will not be headlong repeal efforts, and we won't hear language about root and branch removal anymore. But I do think that as we saw so powerfully in the Trump administration, there are many, many ways in which the ACA can be undermined or its core goals can be circumscribed through administrative action. The ACA is a complex policy that relies on actions from states, from courts, from regulators, and for that system to work, all of the officials at different levels have to be bought in. And so to the extent that officials in different parts of that complex landscape are not actively trying to promote the ACA, it could remain vulnerable. And we could see, for instance, the exchanges, the insurance pricing on some states' exchanges being unaffordable, particularly if we don't extend the increased subsidies that were just extended in the Inflation Reduction Act for a few more years.
Great, thanks. I do want to point out that one of the questions in the Q&A, I think I can just direct that person to the Kaiser website, was about whether or not there's been survey work disaggregating the components of the ACA versus people's views about the entirety of the law. And I know I've seen those questions before. So to the person who asked that question, I would definitely check out the Kaiser data on that one. But I think, as Molly pointed out, there are very big differences on when you ask people about the law in its entirety versus the components. There is a question in the chat that I want to push you all on just a little bit more about the Inflation Reduction Act. And the person asking the question, what they're really getting at is, if you're a supporter of that law, should you be worried? Like, might we expect some erosion of the provisions in there or a delay, anything that might modify it? I realize that's an impossible question to answer, involves a crystal ball, but what's your best guess?
I would just say I would be worried and I'd be watching it, right? It's not, again, this is not something that the public's actively engaged in or knows about. So it's really a question of experts disagreeing on things and debating that, and, horse trading and whatever else happens on the Hill around it. And there are, specifically the prescription drug negotiations, was not popular among some of the biggest supporters for a Republican campaign. So I'm sure that they are getting a lot of pressure to try to mitigate the implications of the law in every which way you possibly can from a regulatory and an implementation standpoint. So I do think that we'll see a lot of, small, not public facing conversations, but real debates between people who are trying to figure out how to implement this, and where people can put up hurdles and where other people can try to smooth a way to a good, clean implementation. But Allison, I'm sure have more to say on this.
I was going to say something very similar, as I don't imagine we see repeal here. We may see little pieces chipped away at, not on through, kind of baked into things like the omnibus bill or other places where they're less transparent. But I see the drug provisions and the other provisions moving into the administrative process, and and then there may be attempts either through lobbying efforts, through Congress putting pressure on the administrative agencies to try to shape the implementation. But I see that as being one of the pieces where there's a big question mark in terms of what do the regulations look like, what do the agencies do. A little bit less. I don't anticipate that Congress is going to be able to pull the rug out from under those provisions.
Yeah, and I would just echo that one of the strengths of the ACA is because the Democrats briefly enjoyed a 60-vote supermajority in the Senate, they were able to pass it outside of the budget process. And that's part of why the Republicans had such trouble repealing it, because in order to develop a repeal bill that could satisfy the requirements for, the reconciliation process, they had to rely on complex kind of accounting chicanery, and they couldn't remove some of the key elements that they wanted to. So the Democrats were able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act precisely because it is budgetary. It is largely about spending. And that means that with, 50 votes in the Senate, and, you could imagine certainly unified Republican control targeting key elements of it. But I think that in broad strokes, the Inflation Reduction Act is safe so long as Joe Biden is president, or the Democrats hold the presidency and can veto possible large-scale changes. I think one of the big questions that isn't just simply an unknown is if the Republicans do control either chamber, when they start to negotiate over spending in the coming years with the Biden administration, what are their asks? And is it, as in what happened after the 2010 midterms, is it going to be general kind of tamping down on government spending? Might we get another process like sequestration, where you just see widespread budget cuts that are spread kind of indiscriminately across the discretionary parts of the federal budget? I don't know. I don't know what the areas on which the Republicans are going to really focus. I do know that in the Inflation Reduction Act, the proposal to more fully staff the Internal Revenue Service were certainly targeted, and that seems to be among the Republicans' top targets moving forward.
So, Allison, I do want to come back to you about some of the legal landscape around the Dobbs decision. So really what's transpired in the past 6 months or so has been a period of tremendous legal uncertainty, some conflicts between federal regulations, state laws, and now we have a number of actions at the state level to try to enshrine a right to abortion in certain states. Where do you see the legal landscape moving on abortion rights in the country at this point? And how might that play out over the next couple of years?
Yeah, so the key piece here is that the landscape has moved to the states. So the federal government has said that there is no longer a federal right to access abortion, and the states can determine restrictions on it. And why this election is so illuminating is that we saw the movement at the state level all in favor of abortion protection, not in favor of further restriction. So we had, Vermont, Michigan, and California passed by ballot constitutional rights to abortion. Michigan's is really broad. It's a broad right to reproductive freedom. It includes things like post-termination care. It includes contraception. We saw measures defeated in Montana and Kentucky that would have further restricted abortion rights. And, they're different in nature, but Kentucky would have said that the state's constitution does not protect access to abortion. Kentucky already has laws that are restrictive, but this would have enshrined it in the Constitution. Montana's was a more complicated measure. They call it the Born Alive bill, that required care for infants who are born alive, even if they have a fatal prognosis. And so this is states of all different sorts across the board where people are going to the polls and they are voting against abortion restrictions. And so I think what that is signaling to the state legislatures is be careful where you act here, because the people may be unhappy if you put restrictive measures in place, and then that could affect future elections. I mean, and this plays out in all different kinds of ways. I think about in Pennsylvania here, there's a possibility that I don't know if they have called it yet, but the Pennsylvania House may be Democratic majority for the first time in forever. I don't know when the last time was, but it has been a strong Republican majority in the House and the Senate in Pennsylvania. And one of the reasons why I was watching that election is because there were efforts to pass a constitutional amendment in Pennsylvania that would restrict action, would be similar to the one in Kentucky that said there's no protection of a right to abortion in the Pennsylvania Constitution, and if the House turns blue in Pennsylvania, that will stop that measure in its tracks. It actually takes action by two separate Congresses in a row to move that forward to a popular vote. So we're watching the states now. The action will be at the states, but I think this election really signaled what people, what kind of the population is looking for from their state legislatures. The one other thing I'll say is that if you break down those ballot measures and you look at the votes on them, they are close, which tells you we still do have a very divided electorate. It's not like they were, the Montana and Kentucky ones were defeated by very narrow margins. So it will continue to be a contentious issue at the state level and in front of the state legislatures.
Yeah, so for those of our in our audience who are not in Pennsylvania, which I assume are many people, we've had the double benefit of being in a swing state for national politics, and now our state legislative chamber is also down to 2 seats that we're waiting to hear how those will be decided. So we are certainly ground zero in this world of divided government and political polarization, for sure. I do want to see if we can just quickly touch on this question before I have a wrap-up question for you all. And that is, if you're waking up a week from now and you're running a federal agency and you are now facing divided government in terms of the Republicans being in the House majority, and regardless of what happens to the Senate, how does the work of the health agencies change or be influenced by a congressional realignment?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think what we saw largely as a result of the COVID pandemic is the real politicalization of the agencies. I mean, prior to the pandemic, when we would ask people, do you even know what the FDA does? Do you know what the CDC does? Lots of people just said no. They don't have any idea. They have sort of generally positive feelings about them. They sound like good, wholesome organizations that would help us, but whatever, they wouldn't really know. And over the course of the pandemic, we've seen the work of a lot of the health agencies very, very politicized. And I anticipate that that will be exacerbated. I also anticipate, and we've heard a lot of talk about the Republicans, if they do take the House, doing a lot of investigations and a lot of, hearings. I imagine that, we will see some of our federal agency heads being dragged back up to answer questions on Congress about all sorts of things, and maybe even relitigating a lot of pandemic decision making and challenges. And so and then as Dan pointed out, all the funding situation is really in the air. So I don't think it's super it's not, you don't get to say, oh yay, we get to like host now for the next 2 years. I have a feeling it won't be all that pleasant at the top of the agencies going forward.
All right, so I'm looking at the clock. I know we just have just a few minutes left before we hit 1 o'clock here in Philadelphia. So I do want to ask you all for a wrap-up question here. And the question is really, elections are often reset moments in politics. They sort of reshuffle the agenda a bit. They create a new set of priorities. And in your view, what do you see as the bright spots of the election moving forward? And what can we be optimistic about regarding advancing health policy that can make a difference in the health of Americans? Who wants to take that one first? Allison.
I'm happy to.
Go ahead, Molly.
I would just say that I found the enthusiasm and the turnout. We don't know exactly where turnout is, but clearly it was high. And so I find that as sort of a bright spot, especially when we've been hearing so much talks about threat of our democracy coming, undone. We didn't see a lot of political violence. And even in the course of these very tight races, there's a little bit of rumblings of, stolen or whatever, but we're not seeing what we saw after 2020. So to me, that is a sense of calm going forward, that, our democracy is still standing strong at the moment. And so that bodes well for everything in our nation, but, also health policy. So.
Thank you, Molly. Allison?
I was pleased watching how a lot of things played out at the state level, understanding that states are evolving, states are more heterogeneous than we consider them to be. We saw some really interesting things in gubernatorial elections. For example, we saw the first 2 openly lesbian governors elected in Oregon and Massachusetts. I'm still watching Arizona now with the election there, and one of the reasons why that's interesting is because the Republican candidate who's running behind right now is being held up as a future leader of the Republican Party. And so it's one of the things that I think was really interesting about this election is, watching some states that used to be swing states like Florida become less swing states than before, but seeing that other states, the composition is changing and how voters think about issues is changing. So it leaves the question of politics and what we're likely to see come out of the states an interesting puzzle for those of us who think about these questions going forward.
Yeah, on that theme, for years we have seen a decline in split ticket voting, rising polarization among voters, and nonetheless, in a tightly divided country, even if a small number of voters are swing voters, we may well, Allison just mentioned Arizona. Arizona could well have a senator from one party and a governor from the other party. Nevada, that may well be the outcome as well. And we're likely to see that potentially from Georgia. And I think that the split ticket voting and the fact that some of the candidates who had spent less time thinking about what they would do with public policy, were less oriented towards public policy and more towards revving people up symbolically and deepening our divisions. Some of those candidates lost. And I think that, I will always celebrate now more than I would have in the past, any election that comes off without significant violence. And I think that one other threat to our democracy that's a sort of slower rolling threat is redistricting. And I think that we saw in some cases newly competitive districts. And, so Allison mentioned the Pennsylvania House. Also, you see several Republicans winning in New York State, which is not typically, has not sent that many Republicans to Congress. And I think that it is to the good if our larger states are sending both Republicans and Democrats, and that there are, at least in some places, competitive districts that can help our democracy continue to stabilize.
Well, I want to thank the three of you. I know we asked you to take on a tough task today, which is to respond in the moment to a evolving election picture without having a final answer. And so I know our audience appreciated your reflections and thoughts on what it all means for American health policy. I do want to just let our audience know that we will be back on December 2nd for an event on reimagining a sustainable healthcare safety net. And so you could see the excellent panelists that we have lined up for that event. So thank you again to our experts, and have a great weekend.